Darius Walker, a black man with sharp features and piercing eyes, walked into Arthur Morgan's office with slow but heavy steps. The expansive room was bathed in cold light from the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting the gray, stormy Seattle sky, an unspoken mirror to the turmoil inside him. Behind the imposing desk hung a portrait of Arthur, a white man with perfectly combed silver hair, a constant reminder of the unyielding power he wielded. Arthur stood by the window, his back turned, exuding authority in a tailored suit that fit him like armor. When Darius entered, Arthur turned, his icy blue eyes locking onto Darius with an expression that betrayed both disdain and control. Clara, a fair-skinned woman with fiery red hair, sat perched on the edge of a chair, her trembling hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her pale face, marked by guilt and worry, was a stark contrast to Arthur's calculated composure.
"Walker?"
Arthur began, his deep voice resonating with authority.
"Take a seat. We need to talk."
Darius remained standing, his shoulders square, his dignity intact despite the weight pressing down on him.
"I'll stand,"
he replied, his voice steady but laced with suppressed anger.
"What's this about?"
Arthur smirked faintly, walking to his desk to pick up a neatly printed document. He held it up like evidence in a trial.
"Clara,"
he said sharply, turning to his daughter.
"Tell him."
Clara opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. Her tearful green eyes met Darius's, brimming with remorse, but she quickly averted her gaze.
"Darius,"
she stammered, her voice barely audible.
I told my father that the baby is yours."
The room fell into a heavy silence, thicker than the storm clouds outside. Darius closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to process the weight of her words. When he opened them, his gaze fell on Clara, filled with a mixture of disbelief, anger, and heartbreak.
"You said what?"
Darius whispered, his voice trembling, not with fear, but with fury barely contained. Clara broke down, her face in her hands.
"I didn't know what to do. I was scared. My father would never forgive me if I told him the truth. I thought—"
Her voice cracked into a series of sobs. Arthur interrupted, his voice cutting through her cries without a shred of concern.
"That's enough, Clara. Don't make this worse."
He turned back to Darius, his cold expression showing no sympathy.
"Walker, this ends here. You're fired. And if I hear a single word about this outside these walls, I'll make sure you never work anywhere again."
Darius stood frozen, his hands clenched at his sides as Arthur's words sank in. He looked at Clara one last time, seeing her drowning in her own guilt, but it did nothing to temper the rage boiling inside him.
"So, that's it,"
Darius said finally, his voice calm but as sharp as a blade.
"You've decided to believe a lie to protect your image, and you."
He turned to Clara, his voice cracking slightly.
"You sacrificed me to save yourself."
Clara sobbed harder, unable to speak. Arthur shrugged indifferently.
"This meeting is over. Pack your things, Walker."
Darius didn't reply. Instead, he turned and walked out of the office, his head held high. His eyes, dark and intense, no longer reflected confusion or fear. They burned with determination. It was the look of a man ready to fight back, no matter how much power Arthur thought he had. Seattle was alive that morning, its streets pulsing with energy as people bustled to and fro beneath the ever-present gray clouds. The city seemed a perfect metaphor for Darius Walker's life. Busy, determined, but overshadowed. Inside the gleaming tower of Morgan Innovates, one of Seattle's leading tech companies, the hum of productivity filled the air. For Darius, this place represented both his aspirations and his frustrations. He had been here for 3 years, navigating the maze of corporate politics with the same precision he applied to his code. As a senior software engineer, Darius had proven himself to be a valuable asset. His ideas had propelled key projects forward, saving the company both time and money. Yet, for all his efforts, he often found himself overlooked, his contributions treated as footnotes to the success of the company's CEO, Arthur Morgan. Arthur was the kind of man who embodied power. His name was etched on every corner of the company, his portrait hung in the lobby, and his voice carried an authority that left little room for dissent. To the outside world, Arthur was a self-made visionary, a beacon of success. But to those within his orbit, especially someone like Darius, he was an unyielding force, a man whose praise was scarce and whose criticism could crush. Darius adjusted his tie as he stepped off the elevator onto the 7th floor. The tension in his shoulders was almost habitual by now, a response to the pressures he faced daily. But today was different. Today, the company was hosting its annual team-building event, a thinly veiled attempt to foster unity in a workplace where hierarchies were unspoken but deeply felt. As the employees filed out to a local cafe in Fremont, Darius lagged behind, his thoughts elsewhere. Team-building exercises were hardly his idea of productivity, and he couldn't help but feel these events were more about Arthur showcasing his dominance than fostering camaraderie. Still, Darius went, knowing that his absence would only draw more scrutiny. The Fremont Coffee Company was a charming departure from the sterile walls of Morgan Innovates. Its wooden interiors and soft lighting offered a warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold, corporate atmosphere Darius had grown accustomed to. The rich aroma of coffee mingled with the low hum of conversation, creating an almost tranquil backdrop. Darius found himself gravitating toward the edges of the crowd, preferring the quiet over forced small talk. He sipped his coffee, his eyes scanning the room absently, when a voice broke through his thoughts. "Darius Walker, I almost didn't recognize you." He turned, and there she was, Clara Morgan. Time had barely touched her. Her fiery hair framed a face that still carried the same spark of curiosity he remembered. But there was something else now, a depth in her gaze that suggested she'd lived through her own share of challenges. Their history came rushing back. They had met in college, two young minds immersed in the world of technology and design. Clara had been the creative force, sketching bold ideas, while Darius had brought those ideas to life through his meticulous coding. Their partnership had been seamless, their friendship genuine, but life, as it often does, had taken them on separate paths. As Clara approached, the memories began to fade, replaced by the present. She extended her hand, and Darius shook it, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Clara," he said, his voice tinged with surprise. "It's been a while." "A lifetime," she replied with a soft laugh. "What are you doing here? Wait, don't tell me. You're working for my dad?" Darius hesitated, unsure of how to respond. The weight of Arthur's name hung between them, unspoken but palpable. Finally, he nodded. "Yeah, I'm at Morgan Innovates." Clara tilted her head, her expression shifting from surprise to something unreadable. "How's that going for you?" "It's challenging," Darius said carefully, choosing his words as if Arthur himself might overhear. Clara didn't press him. Instead, she gestured to the table beside them. "Care to catch up? I've got time." As they sat, the world around them seemed to blur. They spoke of old times, reminiscing about late-night projects, and the professors who had pushed them to their limits. Clara shared stories of her freelance work as a photographer and UX designer, her passion evident in every word. She painted vivid pictures of her travels, of the people she'd met, and the projects that had inspired her. In return, Darius shared snippets of his own journey, though his words were more guarded, his tone subdued. What struck him most was Clara's candor. She spoke openly, unburdened by the constraints of corporate life. It was a stark contrast to the careful, measured way Darius had learned to navigate his world. Her laughter came easily, her curiosity unfiltered. For the first time in a long while, Darius felt like he wasn't just surviving, he was living. But beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of tension. Clara's name carried weight, and Darius couldn't ignore the implications. Her father's shadow loomed large, even here, in the warmth of the cafe. It was a reminder that whatever connection they shared, it would be complicated. The event eventually wound down, employees dispersing back to their routines. But as Clara and Darius lingered near the cafe's entrance, the conversation took a more personal turn. "It's good to see you again," Clara said, her tone soft but sincere. "Let's not wait another lifetime to catch up." Darius nodded, though his mind was already racing. Could he allow himself to be drawn into Clara's orbit again, knowing the risks? Could he afford to let his guard down in a world that constantly demanded he prove his worth? As Clara walked away, her figure disappearing into the bustling streets of Fremont, Darius stood rooted in place. Her words lingered in his mind, mingling with a quiet hope he hadn't felt in years. Perhaps, he thought, some risks were worth taking. The following days at Morgan Innovates were a return to routine for Darius. The hum of keyboards, the brisk exchanges of ideas, and the occasional sharp reprimands from management filled the office. Yet, something had shifted within him. The brief encounter with Clara lingered in his mind, a beacon of warmth and familiarity in a world often marked by indifference. Darius was no stranger to navigating the labyrinth of expectations here. His work was scrutinized more harshly, his successes acknowledged more sparingly. It wasn't something explicitly stated, but the undertone was always clear. He had to work twice as hard to be considered equal. And Arthur Morgan? Arthur was the embodiment of those unspoken expectations, a man whose mere presence commanded both respect and unease. It was on a particularly gray afternoon that the team received a memo summoning them to the executive conference room. Darius's stomach tightened as he skimmed the email. The Salerno project, the company's latest and most ambitious undertaking, was falling behind schedule, and Arthur had decided it was time to intervene. The conference room was a cavernous space lined with glass walls that offered a panoramic view of Seattle's skyline. Inside, the tension was almost tangible. Arthur stood at the head of the table, his commanding presence filling the room. His tailored suit and meticulously combed silver hair gave him an air of authority that left no room for defiance. As the team filed in, Darius took a seat near the end of the table, his laptop open and ready. Arthur began without preamble, his tone sharp and direct. He outlined the delays plaguing the Salerno project and made it clear that failure was not an option. "I don't care what obstacles you're facing," Arthur said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Solutions, not excuses. That's what I expect from this team." Darius listened, his jaw tightening. He had spent weeks on the Salerno project, navigating a web of technical challenges that required meticulous planning and execution. Rushing the process, as Arthur seemed to suggest, would only result in a subpar product, something Darius knew the company couldn't afford. When Arthur's gaze landed on him, it was as though the air in the room grew heavier. "Walker," Arthur said, his tone laced with expectation. "You're leading the technical side. Where are we on this?" Darius met Arthur's gaze, forcing himself to remain composed. "We're making progress, sir. The prototype is nearly complete, but there are a few key components we need to refine before." "There's no time for refining," Arthur interrupted, his voice hard. "This project is already weeks behind. I need results." Darius could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, the unspoken pressure to concede, but something in him refused to yield. He straightened in his seat, his voice steady as he replied, "With all due respect, rushing the process could compromise the final product. If we want this to succeed, what I want," Arthur snapped, cutting him off again, "is a team that can meet deadlines. If you're not capable of that, perhaps I need to reconsider who's leading this effort." The room fell silent. Darius's pulse quickened, but he didn't flinch. He knew this was Arthur's way of asserting control, of reminding everyone who held the power. Still, Darius held his ground. "I understand your concerns, sir," he said evenly. "But I believe delivering a product that meets our standards is more important than cutting corners to save time." Arthur's eyes narrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, the room felt frozen, the tension thick enough to suffocate. Then, with a curt nod, Arthur moved on, shifting his attention to another team member. By the time the meeting ended, Darius felt both exhausted and resolute. He knew he had walked a fine line, but he also knew he couldn't afford to compromise his integrity. As the team dispersed, Samantha fell into step beside him. "Bold move," she murmured, glancing at him sideways. "You know how much he hates being challenged." Darius gave a faint smile, though his mind was elsewhere. "Sometimes it's necessary." Samantha nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Just be careful. Arthur doesn't forget things like that." That evening, Darius found himself back in Fremont, the familiar streets offering a sense of solace. The cafe was quieter now, its usual bustle replaced by a more subdued atmosphere. He ordered a coffee and found a seat near the window, the city's lights shimmering in the distance. He had barely taken a sip when a shadow fell across the table. Looking up, he saw Clara standing there, her camera slung over one shoulder and a soft smile playing on her lips. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. Darius gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Be my guest." As Clara settled in, the tension of the day began to melt away. There was something about her presence that felt grounding, as though she existed outside the noise and chaos that so often defined his world. They talked for hours, the conversation flowing effortlessly as they shared stories of their respective paths since college. Clara spoke of her passion for photography, of the people and places that had shaped her work. Darius found himself captivated by her stories, her words painting vivid pictures that felt almost tangible. In return, he opened up about his own journey, though he carefully avoided the more difficult truths about his struggles at Morgan Innovates. As the evening wore on, the conversation took a more reflective turn. Clara leaned back in her chair, her eyes thoughtful as she looked at him. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked. "The company, I mean. Doing something else." Darius hesitated, her question catching him off guard. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But I've worked hard to get where I am. I don't want to throw that away." Clara nodded slowly, her gaze steady. "I get that. But don't let my dad, or anyone else, make you forget your worth." Her words stayed with him long after they parted ways, echoing in his mind as he walked home through the quiet streets of Fremont. For all the challenges he faced, for all the battles he fought every day, there was something about Clara's belief in him that made the fight feel a little less lonely. By the time Darius reached his apartment, the city had settled into its nighttime rhythm. He stood by the window, looking out at the glowing skyline, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps things could change. Perhaps there was more to his story than what Morgan Innovates had written for him. And perhaps, just perhaps, Clara might be part of that change. The days that followed Clara and Darius's meeting at the cafe were a blur of routine and reflection. While Darius buried himself in his work, Clara wrestled with her own mounting worries. Their interactions had rekindled a connection she hadn't realized she'd missed, but they also stirred a storm she hadn't anticipated. Clara's world was a fragile balancing act. As much as she valued her independence, her father's influence loomed over every aspect of her life. Arthur Morgan was more than just a father. He was an enigma of authority, whose expectations shaped not only Clara's choices, but her entire sense of self. And now, with a secret that threatened to shatter that delicate balance, Clara found herself teetering on the edge. It was late one evening when Clara sat alone in her apartment, staring at the results of a pregnancy test on the countertop. The double lines glared back at her, their stark simplicity belying the tidal wave of emotions they unleashed. Fear, joy, uncertainty. They all swirled within her, each vying for dominance. She thought of Darius, of the ease and comfort he brought into her life, and then of her father, whose approval often felt like a mirage just out of reach. Arthur would never accept this. Not the pregnancy, and certainly not the idea of Darius being involved. Clara's hands trembled as she dialed her best friend, Rachel, her voice shaky when the call connected. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her words tumbling out like a confession. "I can't tell my dad, Rachel. He'll lose it." Rachel's voice was calm but firm. "You need to be honest, Clara, with everyone. Hiding this will only make things worse." But honesty felt like a luxury Clara couldn't afford. She couldn't bear to face her father's wrath, or to drag Darius into the storm that would inevitably follow. She spent the night pacing her apartment, the walls closing in as the weight of her secret grew heavier. The next morning, Clara decided she had no choice but to tell her father. She rehearsed her words on the drive to the family estate, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. She knew Arthur wouldn't take the news well, but she hoped, perhaps naively, that he might show a glimmer of understanding. Arthur was in his study when Clara arrived, his attention fixed on a stack of reports. The room smelled of leather and aged whiskey, the faint hum of classical music playing in the background. He glanced up as she entered, his expression softening briefly before returning to its usual sternness. "Clara," he said, setting his papers aside, "this is a surprise. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Her throat tightened as she sat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Dad, I need to tell you something, and I need you to try to keep an open mind." Arthur's brow furrowed, but he gestured for her to continue. Clara took a deep breath, the words catching in her throat before she finally forced them out. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was suffocating. Arthur stared at her, his face unreadable, before leaning back in his chair. "I see," he said finally, his voice measured. "And who, may I ask, is the father?" Clara hesitated, her heart pounding. She knew the truth would only make things worse, but the thought of lying felt equally unbearable. In her panic, her mind latched onto the one name she knew would buy her time, one name that carried enough weight to distract Arthur from her own culpability. It's Darius Walker. The room seemed to freeze, the air growing colder as Arthur's expression darkened. Walker? He repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. One of my employees? Are you telling me that man had the audacity to— It wasn't like that, Clara interrupted, her voice trembling. It's complicated. Complicated? Arthur's voice rose, his composure slipping. You think this is complicated? My own daughter involved with someone like him? Someone who clearly sees this as an opportunity to exploit our family? Dad, stop, Clara pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. Darius didn't— But Arthur had already made up his mind. He rose from his chair, his presence towering over her. I'll handle this, he said coldly. If Walker thinks he can use you to climb the ladder, he's sorely mistaken. Clara opened her mouth to protest, but Arthur's expression silenced her. There was no reasoning with him, no space for explanations. The storm she had feared was already unleashed, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The next day at Morgan Innovates began like any other, but for Darius, something felt off. There was a tension in the air, a sense of unease he couldn't quite place. It wasn't until mid-morning that he was summoned to Arthur's office, the email terse and devoid of context. As he entered the room, Arthur was standing by the window, his back to the door. The city stretched out before him, a sea of glass and steel that mirrored his impenetrable demeanor. Walker, Arthur said without turning, take a seat. Darius complied, his posture straight and his expression neutral. He had learned long ago to mask his emotions in these moments, to give nothing away. Arthur turned, his gaze piercing. I'm going to get straight to the point, he said, his voice devoid of warmth. I've received some troubling information, and I need to know if it's true. Darius frowned, confusion flickering across his face. I'm not sure what you mean, sir. Arthur's jaw tightened. My daughter, Clara. She claims you're the father of her child. The words hit Darius like a physical blow. He stared at Arthur, his mind racing to process what he had just heard. What? He managed, his voice barely above a whisper. That's not— I don't want your excuses, Arthur interrupted, his tone icy. I want the truth. Did you or did you not take advantage of Clara? Darius's shock quickly gave way to anger. He rose from his chair, his hands clenched at his sides. With all due respect, sir, that's not what happened. Clara and I are friends, nothing more. Arthur's eyes narrowed, his disbelief evident. You expect me to believe that? Do you think I'm blind to what's going on? Believe what you want, Darius said, his voice firm. But I'm telling you the truth. Arthur stepped closer, his presence almost suffocating. Let me make one thing clear, Walker. You're done here, effective immediately. I won't have someone like you tarnishing my family's reputation or this company's name. Darius stared at him, his chest heaving with a mix of rage and disbelief. You can't just— Try me, Arthur said coldly. Your things will be packed by the end of the day. Darius walked out of the office, his mind reeling. The weight of Arthur's accusations pressed down on him, suffocating in its intensity. He had lost his job, his reputation was in jeopardy, and the life he had worked so hard to build was crumbling before his eyes. As he stepped out into the cold Seattle air, the reality of his situation began to sink in. He was alone, his name tarnished, and his future uncertain. But beneath the despair, a spark of resolve began to grow. He wouldn't let this break him, not yet. The door to Morgan Innovates closed behind Darius with a finality that felt suffocating. The air outside was brisk, biting against his skin as he stood on the curb, trying to steady his racing thoughts. The weight of Arthur's accusations sat heavily on his chest. Everything he had worked for, his career, his reputation, was now in jeopardy because of a lie he hadn't even had the chance to defend against. Seattle's streets, usually alive with the hum of activity, felt muted. The city seemed to mock him with its indifference as he walked toward the subway station. Faces blurred past him, strangers with lives that continued uninterrupted while his had been derailed in a matter of minutes. At home, the small apartment in Fremont offered little solace. The walls, once a haven after long days at work, now seemed to close in on him. Darius dropped his bag by the door and sat heavily on the edge of his bed. The silence was deafening, and the thoughts swirling in his mind refused to settle. Why had Clara implicated him? The Clara he knew would never have done something so reckless, so damaging. Was it fear, pressure from her father, or was it something else entirely? He replayed their last conversation at the cafe in his mind. She had been warm, genuine, even encouraging. The idea that she had turned his life upside down so casually felt incomprehensible. The next morning, Darius's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. News traveled fast, and Arthur had wasted no time ensuring that his narrative reached the right ears. Emails from colleagues went unanswered, their messages filled with either cautious condolences or thinly veiled curiosity. Darius knew what they wanted: to confirm the rumors, to pry into the spectacle of his downfall. But the message that finally drew his attention was from Samantha. "Call me when you can," it read. "We need to talk." Her voice was steady, but tinged with anger when she answered his call. "Darius, what the hell happened? Arthur's been storming around and everyone's talking about how you're inappropriate with Clara. Is it true?" "Of course it's not true," Darius said sharply, his frustration spilling over. "Clara and I are just friends. Arthur didn't even let me explain. He just decided I was guilty." Samantha sighed on the other end of the line. "Figures. He's always been quick to judge, especially when it comes to you. But this is bad, Darius. Arthur's painting you as some kind of predator, and people are eating it up." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Darius gritted his teeth. "I'm not going to let him get away with this." "And what are you going to do?" Samantha's tone softened. "Arthur has money, power, and connections. He can make your life hell if he wants to. You've already seen how fast he's moved." Darius didn't have an answer. The reality of the situation was grim, and he knew it. Arthur had the means to destroy not just his career, but his name. The thought of fighting back felt like an impossible uphill battle. "Just be careful," Samantha said. "If there's anything I can do, let me know. But promise me you won't make any rash decisions." Darius promised, though the weight of her words only deepened the pit in his stomach. The following days passed in a haze. Without a job to ground him, Darius spent most of his time at home, avoiding calls and emails. His landlord's polite but firm reminder about rent felt like a cruel reminder of how precarious his situation had become. Eventually, the silence became too much. Darius ventured out to Fremont Coffee Company, hoping the familiar space might offer some clarity. The cafe was quiet, the late afternoon lull leaving only a handful of patrons scattered across its cozy interior. Darius ordered a coffee and found a seat near the window, staring out at the street as he tried to piece together his next move. But his solitude was interrupted by a voice he hadn't expected to hear so soon. "Darius?" He turned, and there she was, Clara Morgan. Her face was pale, her expression a mix of guilt and hesitation. She approached cautiously, her hands gripping the strap of her bag tightly. "Can I sit?" she asked softly. Darius gestured to the seat across from him, his jaw tightening. He didn't trust himself to speak yet. Clara sat, her eyes darting to his face, searching for something. Understanding, forgiveness, perhaps both. "I'm sorry," she began, her voice trembling. "I didn't know what else to do. My dad. He was furious and I panicked. I thought if I said your name it would, I don't know, buy me some time." Darius's eyes narrowed. "Buy you time? Clara, do you have any idea what you've done? Arthur fired me. He's spreading lies about me to anyone who will listen. My career is in ruins because of you." Clara flinched at his words, tears pooling in her eyes. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was scared. I knew he'd never accept the truth, and I thought I could fix it later." "Fix it?" Darius's voice rose, drawing a few glances from nearby tables. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "How do you plan to fix this, Clara? How do you undo the damage you've done?" "I'll tell him the truth," she said quickly, her desperation evident. "I'll tell him it wasn't you, that I lied. I'll make him stop." Darius shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. "You really think he'll believe you now? After everything? Arthur doesn't back down. Admitting you lied will only make things worse. For both of us." Clara's shoulders slumped, her guilt weighing visibly on her. "I'm so sorry, Darius. I didn't know what else to do." For a moment, Darius considered walking away, leaving her to deal with the fallout on her own. But as he looked at her, saw the genuine remorse in her eyes, his anger began to cool. It wouldn't erase what she had done, but at least she seemed willing to face the consequences. "Fine," he said finally. "You tell him the truth. But don't expect him to forgive you easily. And don't expect me to clean up your mess." Clara nodded, her relief tempered by the weight of what lay ahead. "Thank you, Darius, for not hating me." He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the street outside. The storm Arthur had unleashed still raged, and Darius knew the fight was far from over. But at least now, he had one small step toward reclaiming his life. Seattle's relentless rain mirrored the storm brewing in Darius's life. Days had passed since he was unceremoniously fired, but the shock had yet to subside. Each morning he woke with a fleeting hope that the events of the past week had been a nightmare. But reality hit hard every time he glanced at his phone, filled with messages from friends, former colleagues, and a few opportunistic reporters looking for a story. His name, once associated with innovation and dedication, was now whispered in corners, marred by scandal. Arthur Morgan's accusations had spread like wildfire, and though Darius's integrity should have been unquestionable, the weight of Arthur's influence made the truth irrelevant. Darius was out of the tech world, for now, perhaps forever. The first blow came the day after his termination. A meeting with a potential employer, one he had meticulously prepared for, was abruptly canceled. The email he received was vague, full of polite platitudes, but the subtext was clear. Morgan Innovates had made sure no one in Seattle's tech industry would touch him. The rejection wasn't a surprise, but it still stung. Darius had worked tirelessly to build his career, overcoming countless barriers along the way. Now, with one sweeping act of vengeance, Arthur had erased years of progress. The injustice of it burned in his chest, but there was no clear path to fight back. Arthur Morgan held all the cards. As the days turned into a week, Darius's savings began to dwindle. The rent for his modest apartment in Fremont loomed over him, along with the other mundane but unforgiving realities of adult life. Without a steady income, his safety net was rapidly unraveling. He took odd jobs where he could find them, repairing laptops, debugging amateur software, even assembling furniture for neighbors. It was a far cry from the ambitious projects he had once led, but it paid for groceries and kept his mind occupied, if only temporarily. Still, the hours between jobs were the hardest. Sitting alone in his apartment, surrounded by reminders of the life he had lost, Darius felt the weight of despair creeping in. He avoided social media, unable to stomach the whispers and innuendos circulating about him. Even reaching out to friends felt impossible. Every conversation seemed destined to circle back to the same humiliating topic. One evening, as the rain drummed against his window, Darius found himself staring at his old Morgan Innovates badge. The glossy photo stared back at him, a younger version of himself, filled with optimism and hope. He thought of all the late nights spent at his desk, the sacrifices he'd made to climb the ladder. And for what? To be discarded like he was nothing. The anger that simmered beneath his grief flared, filling him with a restless energy. He grabbed his jacket and left the apartment, needing to escape the suffocating walls that seemed to close in tighter with every passing moment. The streets of Fremont were quieter than usual, the rain driving most people indoors. Darius found himself wandering aimlessly until he reached a familiar corner, the Fremont Coffee Company. The cafe's warm glow spilled onto the wet pavement, beckoning him in. Inside, the air was filled with the comforting scent of freshly brewed coffee and the low murmur of conversation. Darius ordered his usual and found a seat near the back, his thoughts as dark and swirling as the rain outside. He sipped his drink slowly, staring out the window as droplets raced down the glass. "Rough day?" The voice startled him. He looked up to see the barista, a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, standing nearby. "Something like that," he replied, his voice low. She nodded, her expression understanding. "This place has a way of making things feel a little less terrible. Stay as long as you need." Darius managed a small smile, her words a brief balm to his frayed nerves. He stayed until the cafe closed, the simple act of being around others easing the loneliness that had taken root in his chest. But no amount of coffee or fleeting kindness could erase the reality he faced. The next morning, his landlord knocked on his door, a quiet but firm reminder that rent was due. Darius nodded, assuring him it would be handled, though he had no idea how. Desperation began to creep in. He scoured job boards, sending resumes to positions he knew were far beneath his skill level, only to receive more rejections, or, worse, no response at all. The once bright spark of hope that he could bounce back began to dim, replaced by a gnawing fear that his career was over. Amid the chaos, Clara Morgan reached out again. Her messages were hesitant, filled with apologies and offers to meet. At first, Darius ignored her. He didn't know if he could face her without the anger boiling over. But as the days dragged on, he realized he needed answers. If nothing else, he deserved to know why she had dragged his name into her mess. When they finally met, it was in a quiet corner of the same cafe where they had reconnected weeks earlier. Clara looked different, her usual confidence replaced with a nervous energy that made her seem smaller, almost fragile. She apologized again, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush. But Darius cut her off. "I need you to be honest with me, Clara," he said, his voice steady but cold. "Why me? Why did you choose to destroy my life when you could have told the truth?" Her eyes filled with tears as she explained, her voice trembling. She had panicked, she said. Her father's anger had been overwhelming, and she had grasped at the first excuse that came to mind. She hadn't meant for things to spiral out of control, but now she didn't know how to fix them. Darius listened in silence, his anger warring with a reluctant understanding. Clara had been a victim of Arthur's wrath, just as he had. But while Darius had lost his career, Clara was still Arthur's daughter, shielded by the privilege of her name. The disparity between their situations was stark, and it stung. When Clara finished speaking, Darius stood. "I don't know if I can forgive you for what you've done," he said quietly, "but I hope for your sake that you find the courage to stand up to him. Because if you don't, this will keep happening. To you, to me, to anyone who gets in his way." Clara nodded, her tears spilling over as she watched him leave. Darius didn't look back. He couldn't. The weight of her betrayal was too heavy, and he had too much to rebuild to dwell on what might have been. That night, as Darius lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he made a silent promise to himself. Arthur Morgan had taken almost everything from him, but he wouldn't take his will to fight. Somehow Darius would find a way to rise again. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next morning, the overcast Seattle sky cast its usual pall over the city, but for Darius, it seemed heavier than ever. He dragged himself out of bed, his limbs weighed down by a mixture of exhaustion and defeat. The days were blurring together now, marked only by rejection emails and mounting bills. Each hour spent looking for work felt like a futile exercise, a reminder of how effectively Arthur Morgan had dismantled his professional life. By noon, Darius was back in his apartment, sitting at his kitchen table with a laptop and a rapidly cooling cup of coffee. The screen displayed yet another rejection email. This one was curt, with the all-too-familiar line, "We've decided to pursue other candidates." Darius leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as the frustration boiled over. "Other candidates," he muttered bitterly. He knew exactly what that meant. Arthur's influence had poisoned the waters of the tech world, ensuring that no one would hire him without fearing repercussions. The suffocating silence of the apartment pressed in, broken only by the hum of his refrigerator. Darius knew he needed to get out, if only to clear his head. Grabbing his jacket, he stepped outside, letting the cool air hit his face. He walked aimlessly, the rhythm of his footsteps the only thing grounding him as his thoughts churned. Darius found himself at a park near Fremont, its winding trails offering a brief escape from the city's noise. The sound of children's laughter and the occasional bark of a dog provided a stark contrast to the turmoil in his mind. He sat on a bench, watching as life continued around him, unaffected by the storm consuming his world. His thoughts inevitably drifted to Clara, her tearful apology replayed in his mind, alongside her admission of fear. Part of him wanted to hate her for what she had done, for the reckless lie that had upended his life. But another part, quieter yet undeniable, understood her predicament. Arthur Morgan's wrath was a force of nature, and Clara, like him, had been caught in its path. The sound of his phone buzzing in his pocket pulled him from his thoughts. He hesitated before answering, the caller ID showing a name he hadn't expected to see. Samantha. "Darius?" Her voice came through, urgent and slightly breathless. "Yeah, it's me," he said, sitting up straighter. "What's going on?" "You need to see this," she said. "Check your email." Her tone sent a chill down his spine. Darius pulled out his phone, opening his inbox to find an email from Samantha. The subject line read, "Internal memo, Morgan innovates." Attached was a PDF, its file name a string of numbers and letters. He opened it, his eyes scanning the document quickly. The memo detailed an investigation into alleged misconduct involving a senior engineer and a member of the Morgan family. Though it didn't name him explicitly, the timing and context left no doubt that it referred to him. Worse, the language painted a damning picture, implying not only impropriety, but also potential legal action. Darius's grip on his phone tightened as he read the final paragraph. Morgan Innovates maintains a zero-tolerance policy towards such behavior and will pursue all necessary steps to ensure accountability. The weight of the memo hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about tarnishing his reputation anymore. It was a full-scale character assassination. Arthur wasn't content with firing him. He was determined to erase any chance Darius had of rebuilding his life. "I can't believe this," Darius said into the phone, his voice trembling with anger. "He's trying to destroy me." "I know," Samantha said, her tone soft but firm. "But you can't let him win, Darius. You need to fight back." "How?" he asked, the desperation in his voice clear. "Arthur owns this city. He owns the narrative. What am I supposed to do? Sue him? Take on a billionaire in court?" "There are other ways," Samantha said. "You don't have to go through this alone. There are people who can help, lawyers, advocates. But you need to decide if you're ready to take that step." Darius was silent for a moment, the enormity of the decision settling over him. Fighting back meant exposing himself to even more scrutiny, more attacks. But doing nothing meant letting Arthur win, allowing the lie to become the truth. "I'll think about it," he said finally. That evening, Darius reached out to an old contact from college, Victor Reynolds, a lawyer who specialized in employment disputes. They hadn't spoken in years, but Victor's reputation for taking on powerful adversaries preceded him. The call was brief but promising. After hearing a summary of Darius's situation, Victor agreed to meet the following day. "If what you're saying is true," Victor had said, "Arthur Morgan has a lot to answer for." For the first time in weeks, Darius felt a glimmer of hope. It was fragile, like a flickering candle in the wind, but it was enough to keep him going. The meeting with Victor took place in a modest office downtown. Victor was sharp, his questions probing but fair as he pieced together the timeline of events. Darius recounted everything: Clara's initial accusation, Arthur's reaction, the firing, and the subsequent smear campaign. When he finished, Victor leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "This is a tough case," he admitted. "Arthur Morgan is powerful, and he's playing dirty. But if we can prove malice, if we can show that he intentionally lied and retaliated against you, we might have a shot." Darius nodded, his resolve hardening. "I don't care how hard it is. I can't let him destroy me like this." Victor smiled faintly, his respect for Darius evident. "Then let's get to work." The next few weeks were grueling. Victor filed a formal complaint, launching what would undoubtedly be a contentious legal battle. The filing caught the attention of local media, and soon, Darius's story began to spread. At first, the coverage was mixed, with some outlets parroting Arthur's narrative. But as Victor dug deeper, cracks began to appear in Arthur's carefully constructed image. Samantha, too, played a critical role, quietly leaking information that contradicted Arthur's claims. Her bravery gave Darius the evidence he needed to push forward, even as the pressure mounted. Through it all, Darius clung to the knowledge that he wasn't alone. Clara, though still grappling with her own guilt, offered her support, vowing to testify on his behalf if necessary. Samantha stood by him, her loyalty unwavering, and slowly, piece by piece, Darius began to reclaim his story. One evening, as he stood on the rooftop of his apartment building, gazing out at the city lights, Darius felt something he hadn't in weeks: hope. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he believed he could win. Arthur Morgan had tried to ruin him, but Darius wasn't broken, not yet. And as long as he had a voice, he wouldn't stop fighting. The courtroom was a paradox of silence and tension, the kind of quiet that hummed with unspoken energy. Darius sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped tightly together as he listened to Victor Reynolds lay out the opening statement. Every word was deliberate, every pause calculated to draw the jury into the story of injustice and retaliation. Across the room sat Arthur Morgan, his expression unreadable. Despite his tailored suit and air of composure, there was something in his eyes, a flicker of discomfort perhaps, or a hint of the cracks beginning to form in his carefully curated facade. Beside him was a team of high-powered attorneys, their presence a testament to his determination to crush Darius in this fight. Victor finished with a confident flourish, his voice steady as he addressed the jury. This case is not just about one man's career. It's about power, truth, and what happens when someone abuses their position to destroy another person's life. We will show you the lengths Arthur Morgan went to in order to silence and discredit my client, and we will prove that Darius Walker deserves justice. Darius's heart pounded as Victor took his seat. This was it, the moment everything would hinge upon. The truth was about to come to light, and with it, the possibility of reclaiming not just his career, but his dignity. As the trial unfolded, the narrative began to take shape. Victor presented evidence of Arthur's smear campaign, emails sent to industry leaders warning them against hiring Darius, internal memos filled with defamatory claims, and the memo Samantha had leaked, which painted Darius as a threat to the company. Each piece of evidence was a small but significant step in dismantling Arthur's story. The jury watched intently as Victor connected the dots, painting a picture of a man who had weaponized his power to ruin a former employee for the sake of his own pride. But the most damning moment came when Clara Morgan took the stand. Clara looked visibly nervous as she walked to the witness box, her hands trembling slightly as she was sworn in. Darius watched her closely, his emotions a turbulent mix of resentment, hope, and unease. Clara's testimony would be crucial, and the stakes were higher than ever. Victor approached her gently, his tone calm and encouraging. "Ms. Morgan, can you tell us about your relationship with Mr. Walker?" Clara nodded, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "We met in college, we worked on several projects together, and we've remained friends over the years. There was never any romantic or inappropriate relationship between us." Victor allowed her words to sink in before continuing. "And can you explain what led to your father accusing Mr. Walker of misconduct?" Clara hesitated, her eyes flickering toward Arthur before returning to Victor. I was scared," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I found out I was pregnant, and I didn't know how to tell my father. When he confronted me, I panicked and said it was Darius. It wasn't true, but I thought it would buy me time to figure things out." There was a murmur in the courtroom as Clara's admission hung in the air. Arthur's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as he leaned toward his attorneys. Victor nodded, his tone sympathetic but firm. "So, you falsely accused Mr. Walker, knowing the impact it would have on his life?" Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she nodded. "Yes. I regret it more than anything. I never meant for it to go this far." Victor turned to the jury, his voice rising slightly for emphasis. "Ms. Morgan, did your father know the truth?" Clara's hesitation was brief but telling. "Yes. I told him the truth a few days later." The courtroom erupted in gasps, the revelation sending shockwaves through the jury and spectators alike. Victor allowed the noise to subside before pressing further. "And what did your father do with that information?" Clara looked down, her voice barely audible. "He ignored it. He said it didn't matter because the damage was already done." At that moment, Darius felt a mixture of vindication and sorrow. The truth was finally out, but the cost of getting here had been immeasurable. Clara's courage in admitting the truth was commendable, but it couldn't undo the weeks of turmoil and humiliation he had endured. Arthur's attorneys scrambled to redirect the narrative, their cross-examination aimed at discrediting Clara's testimony. They painted her as confused, emotional, and unreliable, but the jury's expression suggested that the damage to Arthur's case had already been done. The next witness was Samantha, whose testimony was equally damning. She confirmed the contents of the leaked memo and revealed the internal conversations she had overheard, where Arthur explicitly discussed his intent to blacklist Darius. Her words were a direct challenge to Arthur's claims of innocence, and the jury listened intently. Arthur's attorneys attempted to portray Samantha as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, but her calm demeanor and clear answers left little room for doubt. By the end of the day, the courtroom was buzzing with tension. The cracks in Arthur's story were widening, and for the first time, Darius felt the scales tipping in his favor. But the fight was far from over. Arthur's legal team was formidable, and Darius knew they would use every trick in the book to salvage their case. As he left the courthouse that evening, Darius was met with a throng of reporters, their cameras flashing as they shouted questions. He ignored them, his focus unwavering as he walked toward Victor. "Today was a good day," Victor said, clapping him on the shoulder. "But don't get too comfortable. They're gonna come back swinging tomorrow." Darius nodded, his resolve hardening. "Let them. I'm not backing down." That night, as he sat alone in his apartment, Darius allowed himself a moment of reflection. The journey to this point had been grueling, filled with pain and betrayal. But now, for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that justice might finally prevail. The battle was far from over, but Darius was ready for whatever came next. The truth was on his side, and he wouldn't stop fighting until it was fully exposed. The courtroom was packed the following day, the anticipation palpable as the proceedings resumed. Arthur Morgan's legal team had regrouped overnight, ready to counter the devastating testimony from Clara and Samantha. Darius sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, his hands resting on the polished wood. Beside him, Victor exuded calm confidence, though Darius could sense the tension beneath his composed exterior. Arthur's attorneys began their defense with vigor, focusing on discrediting the testimonies and casting doubt on the intentions of the witnesses. They attempted to paint Clara as a daughter rebelling against her father, her actions driven by resentment rather than truth. But the more they pressed, the more Clara's honesty shone through. Her raw emotion and unwavering account of the events left little room for their insinuations to take hold. When it was Arthur's turn to testify, the room fell silent. The CEO of Morgan Innovates strode to the witness stand, his demeanor as commanding as ever. Yet, as he swore to tell the truth, there was an almost imperceptible hesitation, a crack in the armor of a man who had built his life on control. Victor approached Arthur with deliberate steps, his tone measured but pointed. "Mr. Morgan, you've built a reputation as a powerful and respected leader in the tech industry. Would you agree?" Arthur nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "I would," Victor continued, "and part of that reputation relies on the image of integrity and fairness that you project. Correct?" "Correct," Arthur replied, his tone clipped. Victor's gaze sharpened. "So, when your daughter, Clara Morgan, came to you with her initial accusation against Mr. Walker, what steps did you take to verify its accuracy?" Arthur shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. "I trusted my daughter's word. As any parent would, Victor didn't miss a beat. And when your daughter later recanted her accusation and told you the truth, that Mr. Walker was not involved, what did you do?" Arthur hesitated, the question hanging in the air. "I was skeptical. Clara was under a lot of stress. I believed she was confused." Victor leaned forward, his voice rising slightly. "So, instead of investigating further, you doubled down on the accusation. You fired Mr. Walker, blacklisted him from the industry, and circulated defamatory statements to ensure he couldn't find work. Is that correct?" Arthur's lips thinned, his discomfort now evident. "I acted to protect my family and my company." Victor raised an eyebrow. "By destroying an innocent man's life?" Arthur's attorney objected, but the damage was done. The jury's eyes were fixed on Arthur, their expressions reflecting a growing skepticism. The courtroom drama reached its peak when Victor presented the final piece of evidence, an email exchange between Arthur and a senior executive at a rival company. The email, obtained through discovery, explicitly instructed the executive not to hire Darius, labeling him as a liability and trouble waiting to happen. The words were damning, and as Victor read them aloud, the weight of their impact was visible on the jury's faces. Arthur's defense team scrambled to object, but the damage was irreversible. "This email," Victor said, turning to the jury, "proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Arthur Morgan's actions were not about protecting his family or his company. They were about vengeance. He used his power to destroy Mr. Walker's career, knowing full well that the accusations were false." By the time Victor finished his cross-examination, Arthur's once imposing figure seemed diminished. The man who had towered over boardrooms and wielded influence with ease now sat subdued, his carefully constructed image crumbling before the eyes of the court. As the defense rested, The weight of the trial hung heavy in the air. The jury deliberated for hours, their discussions punctuated by the gravity of the case. For Darius, the waiting was excruciating. Every passing minute felt like an eternity, the outcome dangling just out of reach. Finally, the jury returned, their verdict written on folded paper. The foreperson stood, her voice steady as she read aloud. In the case of Walker versus Morgan Innovates, we find in favor of the plaintiff, Darius Walker. The words hit Darius like a wave, the relief and validation washing over him in a rush of emotion. He felt Victor's hand on his shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of their victory. Across the room, Arthur Morgan's expression was a mix of shock and fury, his attorneys whispering frantically in his ear. The jury awarded Darius significant damages, citing the emotional distress and financial harm caused by Arthur's actions. But for Darius, the victory wasn't about the money. It was about reclaiming his name, his integrity, and his future. As the courtroom emptied, Darius stood by the window, watching the rain streak the glass. Clara approached hesitantly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "For everything. You didn't deserve any of this." Darius turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I appreciate that," he said after a moment. "But sorry doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't erase the damage." Clara nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know. I hope someday you can forgive me." Darius didn't respond right away. He looked back out at the rain, the city blurred beyond the glass. "Maybe someday," he said finally, his tone quiet but firm. "But right now, I need to focus on moving forward." Clara nodded again, her shoulders slumping as she turned to leave. Darius watched her go, a part of him wishing things could have been different, but knowing that the path forward had to be his own. That evening, Darius returned to his apartment, the air feeling lighter than it had in weeks. The fight was over, and he had won. But the victory was bittersweet, a reminder of how fragile and fleeting justice could be. As he sat on his couch, staring at the city lights beyond his window, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Arthur Morgan had tried to break him, but Darius had proven that even the most powerful could be held accountable. And now, with the truth finally unveiled, he was ready to rebuild, not just his career, but his life. The days following the verdict brought a strange mix of quiet and unease for Darius. The courtroom battle was over, but the war wasn't yet won. Arthur Morgan, the man who had cast such a long shadow over his life, had retreated from public view. The media speculated endlessly about his next move, whether he would appeal the decision or disappear into obscurity. Darius, however, wasn't concerned about Morgan's future. He was focused on reclaiming his own. The weight of the ordeal hadn't fully lifted. The damage Arthur had done couldn't be undone with a single courtroom victory. Darius's career, once brimming with potential, was still in shambles, and rebuilding his reputation would take time. Yet, beneath the lingering uncertainty, there was a growing sense of hope, a belief that this could be the beginning of something new. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, as Darius sifted through job postings on his laptop, that the unexpected happened. His phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. He hesitated before answering, unsure of what to expect. "Hello?" he said cautiously. "Mr. Walker," came a calm, composed voice. "This is Catherine Morgan." Darius froze, the name sending a jolt through him. Catherine Morgan, Arthur's wife. He had seen her briefly during the trial, sitting silently beside her husband, her expression unreadable. Now, she was reaching out to him directly. "I hope I'm not intruding," Catherine continued, "but I believe we need to talk, in person." "About what?" Darius asked, his voice guarded. "About Arthur," she said simply, "and about the truth." The meeting was arranged for the following evening at a small, discreet cafe far from the bustling heart of the city. Darius arrived early, his nerves heightened by the mystery of the encounter. He had no idea what Catherine wanted, but the weight of her tone suggested it was significant. When she arrived, Catherine Morgan was the picture of composure. Her tailored coat and perfectly styled hair gave her an air of elegance, but her eyes betrayed a weariness that no amount of polish could hide. She approached his table with a quiet determination, extending a hand as she sat down. "Thank you for meeting me," she said. Darius nodded, still unsure of what to say. "You said you wanted to talk about Arthur?" Catherine folded her hands on the table, her gaze steady. "Yes, but first, I want to say this. I'm sorry for what my husband has done to you. I've stayed silent for too long, but after everything that's happened, I can't stand by anymore." Her words caught Darius off guard. He studied her carefully, searching for any hint of insincerity, but found none. "Why now?" he asked. "Why speak up after all this time?" Catherine sighed, her expression softening. "Because I've seen what Arthur's obsession with control has done. To you, to Clara, and to our family. I can't ignore it anymore. You deserve the truth." What Catherine revealed over the next hour was more damning than anything Darius had imagined. Arthur Morgan, she explained, had a long history of using his power to manipulate and silence those who challenged him. The vendetta against Darius was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of behavior, one Catherine had spent years trying to rationalize and excuse. "Arthur believes that power makes him untouchable," she said quietly. "He's spent decades building that belief, and it's cost him his integrity, his relationships, and now, his reputation." Darius listened in stunned silence, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Catherine's revelations didn't just validate his suspicions. They painted a picture of a man who had lost himself in his pursuit of control. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked finally. Catherine met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "Because you're the first person who's ever stood up to him and won. And because I believe you deserve more than just a courtroom victory. You deserve the chance to reclaim your life, and to ensure Arthur can't hurt anyone else." Before they parted, Catherine handed Darius a small envelope. "Inside is a key to a safety deposit box," she explained. "It contains records, emails, contracts, and other documents that prove just how far Arthur was willing to go to protect his power. I've been holding on to them for years, unsure of what to do. But now, I know they belong in your hands." Darius stared at the envelope, the weight of its implications settling over him. "What do you expect me to do with this?" he asked. "That's up to you," Catherine said, "but I trust you'll use it wisely." As she stood to leave, she paused, her voice soft but firm. "For what it's worth, I'm rooting for you, Mr. Walker. You've shown more courage than most people ever will." That night, Darius sat alone in his apartment, the envelope lying unopened on the table in front of him. He couldn't shake Catherine's words, or the gravity of what she had entrusted to him. The documents inside could be the final blow to Arthur Morgan's empire, but they also carried risks that could drag Darius deeper into the battle he thought was over. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. The truth had to come out. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds of Darius's modest apartment, but the warmth it brought did little to ease his restless mind. The envelope Catherine Morgan had given him sat untouched on the kitchen table, a silent reminder of the decision he now faced. Its presence was both a gift and a burden, a weapon that could finally bring Arthur Morgan to his knees, but one that came with risks Darius couldn't ignore. He stared at it over his morning coffee, the aroma doing little to soothe his nerves. The safety deposit box key inside was a pathway to something bigger, but it was also a leap into the unknown. "Time to stop stalling," he muttered under his breath, grabbing the envelope. He slipped the key into his pocket and left the apartment, determination propelling him forward. The bank was a quiet, sterile space, its beige walls and polished counters lending a sense of order to what felt like chaos inside Darius's mind. After presenting his identification and the key, he was escorted to a private room where the safety deposit box waited. The box was unassuming, its metal surface cool beneath his fingers as he opened it. Inside, a stack of meticulously organized documents rested alongside a USB drive. Darius's breath caught as he realized the magnitude of what he held. Catherine hadn't been exaggerating. This wasn't just evidence. It was a damning indictment of Arthur Morgan's abuse of power. He spent hours poring over the documents in the privacy of his apartment. They revealed years of underhanded deals, threats, and backroom maneuvers orchestrated by Arthur to maintain his dominance. But what stood out most were the emails, correspondence that directly tied Arthur to the smear campaign against Darius. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. The truth was as clear as it was devastating. Darius called Victor Reynolds that evening, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I have something," he said, "something that could end this for good." Victor's response was immediate. Bring it to my office tomorrow morning. We'll go over everything together. The next day, Darius laid the evidence out before Victor, who examined each piece with the meticulous eye of a seasoned litigator. By the time he finished, his expression was a mix of disbelief and admiration. "This is a game changer," Victor said, leaning back in his chair. "If we release this, Arthur Morgan won't just lose his reputation, he could face criminal charges." Darius nodded, the weight of the decision settling over him. "What's the next step?" Victor steepled his fingers, his gaze sharp. "We need to be strategic. If we go public, we need to ensure the timing and delivery leave no room for Morgan to spin the narrative. We'll start by submitting this to the authorities and key media outlets simultaneously. Once the truth is out, there's no putting it back." Darius hesitated for a moment, the enormity of the moment hitting him. This wasn't just about his own vindication anymore. It was about holding a man accountable for decades of unchecked power. "Let's do it," he said finally, his voice firm. The fallout was swift and dramatic. The documents were leaked to a prominent investigative journalist, whose expose on Arthur Morgan hit headlines within days. The article was thorough, detailing not only the accusations against Arthur, but also the evidence supporting them. The emails were published in full, their damning content impossible to refute. News outlets across the country picked up the story, their coverage relentless. Arthur Morgan's name, once synonymous with innovation and leadership, became a symbol of corruption and greed. The board of Morgan Innovates held an emergency meeting, and within 48 hours, Arthur was removed from his position as CEO. But the consequences didn't stop there. Federal authorities launched an investigation into Arthur's activities, citing evidence of fraud and intimidation. For the first time in his life, Arthur Morgan was truly vulnerable. Darius watched the chaos unfold from the sidelines, a quiet sense of triumph mingling with a deeper reflection. He had fought for the truth and won, but the journey had taken its toll. The scars of the battle would remain, reminders of the price he had paid for justice. Clara reached out once more, her message brief but heartfelt. "Thank you for what you've done. I hope this brings you peace." Darius didn't respond immediately. He knew that forgiveness was a journey, not a moment. But he also knew that Clara's courage in coming forward had been a turning point. Without her, the truth might never have come to light. A week later, Darius stood on the rooftop of his apartment building, the city stretching out before him. The air felt different, lighter, as if the weight of the past months had finally lifted. He thought of everything he had endured, the people who had stood by him, and the strength it had taken to see it through. Victor's words echoed in his mind. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about making things right. Darius knew the fight wasn't over. Rebuilding his life would take time, and the wounds Arthur had inflicted wouldn't heal overnight. But for the first time in months, he felt a sense of clarity. The truth had changed everything, not just for him, but for everyone Arthur had wronged. And with that truth, Darius was ready to move forward, not as a victim, but as a man who had faced the worst and emerged stronger.